Hello, everyone, and welcome to this final study in the book of Ruth, Chapter 4. And it has been a pleasure to me to prepare the material and to go through the book again, and I hope it's been helpful to each one of you. I want us to begin in this passage, Chapter 4, is of great interest to those who are Bible students because the narrator details the process by which Ruth becomes the betrothed and ultimately the wife of Boaz. And the vivid narrative is important because it's one of the few documents that in the ancient world that tell us in any detail how a legal procedure of this type would proceed. Let's begin together by reading the first 12 verses. But it says, "Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, 'Turn aside, friend, and sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. Then he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who was come back from the land of Moab, has to sell a piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I'm after you.' And he said, 'I will redeem it.' Then Boaz said, 'On the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance.' The closest relative said, 'I cannot redeem it for myself, because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it.' Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, 'Buy it for yourself,' and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, 'You are witnesses today that I have bought the land from the hand of Naomi, and all that belonged to Elimelech, and that belonged to Chilion, and to Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today.' All the people who were in the court and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and many who achieve wealth, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" In a passage like this, we want to come back and notice some of the details at the outcome of this beautiful story. In verse 1, he uses language "then," and not to be taken in a strict temporal sense or now, but in a matter of sequence. The author is just indicating that Boaz went up, but he does not indicate whether it's before, after, or simultaneous with the proceeding. It is a literary device in the paragraph to draw our attention to Boaz. The gate is a place that played a large role in the cities of Judah, particularly in the ancient times. Excavations revealed that the Palestinian cities were generally built very close, very tight together. And there were no large open spaces like the Roman Forum or the Greek Agora. I had the privilege of being in the city of London some years ago and went to Trafalgar Square and have been in great squares in other big cities. The people of ancient Palestine did not build in this way. And consequently, the gate of the city tended to become the center of city life. And it was a place for any important assembly. For example, we find the kings of Israel and of Judah sitting on thrones in an open place in the entrance of the gate of Samaria in 1 Kings 22 and verse 1. Similarly, King Zedekiah sat in the gate of Benjamin, Jeremiah chapter 38 and verse 7. But preeminently, it was a place where legal affairs, legal business was conducted. People were also sometimes condemned before the elders of the city there in criminal trials, as in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 15. So there's a lot of significance attached to being in the gate of the city. It is of special interest in the present connection that if a man died childless and his brother refuses to marry the widow, the woman was bidden to go up to the gate unto the elders, Deuteronomy 15 and verse 7. And there she was to begin a process of public humiliation of the offender. The gate was the normal place for public business, and specifically for the kind of business that's described in Ruth chapter 4. The kinsman of whom Boaz had spoken makes his way by. He passes by as Boaz knew he would. Now, there's no indication that this kinsman knew much or anything about what was afoot, but Boaz knew that he was bound to pass the gate, and so he just waited. And when he came, Boaz called on him to break off his journey for a bit and to sit with him. And the Hebrew implies that the naming of the man was a specific part of the legal process, though it's not here in the text. In any case, the kinsman he's not an important figure to our narrator. He appears only to renounce his claim on Ruth, and then he disappears. And so his name is not important to our narrator. In verse 2, Boaz proceeded to impanel his jury, so to speak. He took 10 of the elders of the city and sat them down. The elders at that time were men who exercised numerous judicial functions. And thus, if a man, for example, fled the avenger of blood to one of the cities of refuge, it would be the elders of the city who would decide whether or not he was to be admitted. Joshua chapter 20 and verse 4. Such passages show that the elders possess far-reaching powers. They're men of significance and gravitas. In the present day, in this situation that's described, they really play very little part other than to bear witness. But their importance was such that any transaction that was attested by them was of unimpeachable validity. We do not know whether there's any significance to the number 10, or whether there's any legal requirement met by this number or not. Our information from antiquity does not reveal this. In verse 3, the court action begins with Boaz addressing the kinsman. And he tells him that Naomi sells a parcel of land which belonged to Elimelech. Our brother means, of course, our friend, our kinsman. And the verb sells is in perfect tense in the Hebrew, which would normally describe a completed action. The meaning is that Naomi is about to sell that land. Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 6 through 12 seems to show that land would normally be offered to a member of the family before being offered to anyone else. And in this, it is this that Naomi is doing. She's following that protocol. The land in question was Elimelech's share of the common field. And being part of a field that was in common ownership, it may well have been difficult for Naomi to realize on this piece of property. And that may be the reason that she still had it, and despite the poverty to which she and Ruth had been reduced, she's not able to benefit from it. And it would have been Elimelech's before going to Moab, and she scarcely could have taken action relative to it prior to returning to Bethlehem. And so there's no mention made of the land up until now, and no indication of how and when Naomi told Boaz about it. It's further indication that there were contacts and discussions between Boaz and the widows, which are not recorded in our narrative. This means that Boaz's readiness to marry Ruth rested on better knowledge of her than a casual reading of the book might otherwise indicate. There are problems arising from the fact that the land was Naomi's. A comprehensive statement as that in Numbers chapter 27, verses 8 through 11, doesn't really envision a widow as succeeding to her late husband's property. The line of succession there mentioned is first sons, then daughters, then nearest male relative. The widow is not mentioned, though possibly she is presumed to be dead in that text if there were no sons, that she ought to marry the Goel, and the property would go to the son of the new marriage. Women could certainly succeed to land in latter times, however. And the women of 2 Kings 8, 1 through 6, or the woman, I should say, was perhaps a widow. And Judith was certainly a widow. While the Mishnah says that the schools of Hillel and Shammai, famous rabbis, both allowed a widow awaiting levirate marriage to sell. So that it appears there's been development in the legal code to handle, set new precedents and handle situations that they'd not had to face previously. The position then is that Naomi had rights in the land, but we have no knowledge of any legal process by which she could have obtained those rights. We just don't know. It is curious that Boaz speaks of the land before mentioning Ruth. It is possible that the land was in some way tied up with marrying Ruth. Boaz may well have decided that this was good tactics to approach the matter in this manner. He may well have feared that if it were only marrying Ruth or only redeeming the field, the kinsman would accept the responsibility and carry it out. But by linking these two, he presents the man with a double financial burden, that of having the field and that of providing for Ruth's maintenance. And in doing this, he must have had some law or some custom behind him, because the kinsman raises no objection whatsoever when these things are presented to him. Boaz reveals his thoughts on the matter. His I, first person, a personal pronoun, is emphatic. I'll do it. He leaves no doubt that he's taking the initiative. I will uncover your ears, the expression literally is, and it means I'll acquaint you with the facts of this matter. But Boaz did more than pass on facts. He gave advice to the near kinsman that he should buy the land, the importance attached to preventing property from passing out of a family seems strange to us, but the law of God provided that a family's property should not be permanently alienated. If a man were hard-pressed, he might raise money by disposing of his land, but he had the right of redemption if his affairs balanced out and he was more prosperous. He could redeem that land when it improved. And if he were totally unable, one of his kinsmen would be given the opportunity to redeem the land. And if even that failed, then the land would return to the original owners in the year of Jubilee, Leviticus 25 and 28. A family's right to its own land in Israel was inalienable. All of this lies behind this chapter 4. All of these legal precedents lying behind that. Naomi was poor, and she could not retain her land, but it was a solemn family obligation to see that the land was not lost. And it's interesting that the King James Bible takes the next expression as before the inhabitants, and the Revised Standard in the presence of those sitting here. It is more likely, perhaps, that Boaz refers to those sitting as witnesses. He specifically singles out the elders of my people. Now he invites the kinsman to make up his mind. He says, if you will redeem it, redeem it. It shows clearly the legal position that he's advocating. And the kinsman had a perfect right to go ahead, and if he did, no one could say no. No one could refuse that. Alternatively, if he would not redeem it, Boaz asked him to say so. In the same breath, Boaz goes on to assure him that he himself is ready to take over this task. And he means that there is no one ahead of the kinsman, and he is in a position to exercise the right next. It is not without interest that Boaz's eye is emphatic when he says, I am after you, and that the kinsman responds with an equally emphatic, I will redeem it. Or I cannot redeem it, is what he responds. Now Boaz brings out in verse 5 his real interest in the matter. Ruth, as well as Naomi, is concerned with this field. It's all caught up together. And there would be no question of paying a dowry for Ruth, either to her parents in Moab or to Naomi. She would be acquired, but in no sense bought. Boaz is saying that Ruth also has a stake in this field. And since she is the widow of a childless kinsman, this involves necessarily marrying her to raise up a child for the deceased, as well as treating it as a property matter. And so it's important to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. It is concerned only with perpetuating the name of the deceased, which would be done by raising up an heir to take over his land. The dead here, of course, is Mahlon, Ruth's former husband that's passed away. But in raising up Mahlon's name, that of Elimelech would also be continued, because he is the father of Mahlon. In verse 6, the knowledge that redemption of the field and marriage with Ruth went together alters the whole complexion of things for that kinsman. He does not say, I will not redeem, but he says, I cannot redeem. And this is strong language. The reason that he gives is, lest I should damage or harm my own inheritance. The meaning of this is not completely clear, but probably the kinsman is not a wealthy man, and he could perhaps redeem the field, but now he sees that to redeem that will not be an augmentation of his own property. Rather, it will mean a diminution of it, for he must pay to buy the field, and then it's going to belong not to his own personal family, but to the son of Ruth. Normally, in a marriage, this type of field would presumably belong to the widow, not to the widow's mother-in-law. In marrying the widow, the kinsman is going to secure the field, which he could then set against the cost of supporting her. But in this case, he's got to buy the field and in addition provide for Ruth. And that may very well involve quite an expenditure that he can't handle. And so the kinsman, it appears, is certainly ready to buy the field without marrying Ruth, and he may well have been ready to marry Ruth without the field. But what he could not face was doing both of those things. And so under the circumstances, he withdrew his claim to redeem and invited Boaz to take it up. The kinsman repeated his statement that he was not able to redeem. He apparently wants there to be no doubt about that. In verse 7, the narrator now explains the custom, which has evidently become obsolete because he explains it. The writer finds it necessary to explain the custom, and so he likely wrote sometime after these events occurred. They might have been young people when it occurred, and they're all much older now when the narrator writes it. I don't know. But he does explain the custom. It is a transfer of rights, not property, that's in view. The custom is described very simply. To confirm whatever was agreed upon, one man drew off his shoe and gave it to the other. He just gives his sandal to him. From our perspective, it is perhaps a curious custom, at least in being an unusual act. It's certainly going to attract attention of the people that are there, and no doubt that's part of the reason for it, that the people would know that an agreement has been reached. Now, some have objected that this account shows an ignorance of the custom, and that Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, tells us what actually happened. There is no conflict. If you go over to Deuteronomy chapter 25, at verse 7 specifically, you have the case of a man who refuses his widow, his brother's widow. And there is no mention of an alternative kinsman in that text. The man is prepared to let his brother's name perish for selfish reasons. And so the widow is to spit upon him, and his sandal is to be forcibly removed. In Ruth, it is entirely different. The unnamed kinsman appears not to be a close relative, certainly not a brother of the deceased, and he may not have known Ruth, or if he did, he could scarcely have known her very well. And so there seems no reason why he should be humiliated. Moreover, Boaz is quite ready to marry Ruth. And so the question is not, will Ruth be wed? The question is, who will wed her? Under the circumstances, the kinsman himself removes his sandal and hands it to Boaz. And the loosening of the sandal is the action that signifies that the transaction is complete. Ruth chapter 4 shows how it was done when a man simply passed his right to another. Deuteronomy 25 shows how one is humiliated when he refuses to carry out his just responsibilities under family law. Verse 8, the kinsman's speech is resumed. He concludes by passing the responsibility on to Boaz. And in verse 9, Boaz begins this last speech, and in this he directs attention of those present to the salient points to which they are witnesses. He addresses the elders first, as we might expect. But he joins the elders with all the people that are assembled there. In other words, though the witness of the elders is weighty and significant and may be singled out for special mention, the witness of the people is also important. The people are not present simply as bystanders and spectators. They are, like the elders, they are chosen and legal witnesses. Boaz may feel that his transaction is safe, attested by them all. And this is very important, as apparently in that day there were very few things that were written, and nothing is said in the text about writing throughout that whole transaction. But with the crowd of reliable witnesses in a small town like Bethlehem, everything is being established. And his next words reveal that the transaction has been more far-reaching than you might have guessed initially. What Boaz has bought is all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilon's and all that was Mahlon's. He's establishing his full right to the family possession. And this is not only with respect to Elimelech, but to both of his sons as well. Now, it is not at all clear how Chilon comes into this, because Boaz is not marrying Orpah. That's just not left to us. But anyway, all of that property was included. He asserts his right over that. In verse 10, Boaz comes to the heart of the matter. In buying the field, he has also obtained Ruth as a wife. Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, stands first and thus receives emphasis, and that's important. Once again, Ruth is described as the Moabitess, and we learn here and only here that she was the wife of Mahlon. Boaz proceeds to give justification for his levirate-type marriage, first positively and then negatively. Positively, it is to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. That is, to provide a son who would carry on the name of the deceased. Then negatively, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of this place. The brethren will, of course, refer to the whole extended family and all of his relations. His name is not to cease from the family circle. As has been seen, the gate was the center of social and communal life. And so this is equivalent to saying that the name of the deceased will be perpetuated in the community. And having thus formally set forth the effect and the purpose of his action, Boaz concludes by reminding his hearers that they're all witnesses. This action of Boaz in redeeming helpless Ruth has powerful implications for our narrator, our writer's view of God. I mean, what reading did he put on the redemption, the act of redemption by Boaz? Did the writer realize that if a mere man, a creature of God, could behave in this manner described, and indeed by his actions redeem an outcast and bring her into fellowship with God, did he realize then that God must feel at least as compassionate towards all the Ruths of Moab and Babylon and of every other country, every other nation? And secondly, did he realize that God must actually be a God of redemption with the desire and the power to redeem all outcasts into his fellowship with himself? Interesting to ponder. In verse 11, the court session concludes with a statement from the witnesses. First, all the people that are in the gate and the elders respond to Boaz. They respond to his last statement by affirming that they are indeed witnesses. And actually, the assent is given succinctly with a single word: witnesses. It is of interest that all the people are here mentioned ahead of the elders. Clearly, their part was considered more than a mere formality. The people responded with a single word, and the elders carry on with a blessing. Notice that they do not content themselves with discharging their strict legal functions, but they proceed to pronounce a blessing on Boaz and his bride. And they begin with Ruth. They pray that God will make her like Rachel and Leah. It's interesting that though they're Bethlehemites, and thus descended from Judah, the son of Leah. That's Genesis 29:35. They placed Rachel before Leah. And she was, of course, especially beloved, and she died in the neighborhood of their city. Genesis 35:19. Their prayer is a prayer for fruitfulness. These are the only two wives of Jacob, and thus from them, together with their maidservants, is descended the entire nation. So this prayer then looks for a numerous and distinguished progeny. Then they think of Boaz. And they express hope for Boaz's prosperity in a broad sense. In this context, the stress is on wealth and prosperity rather than military eminence. It certainly looks for Boaz to be a happy and a successful man. Be famous in Bethlehem goes on to the consequences of this. As a result of his respectable, noble actions, these well-wishers trust that Boaz will be renowned. In verse 12, they had looked for Ruth to be prolific, and now they repeat the thought with respect to Boaz. It is at first sight curious that they ask for his house, or his household, more specifically, his descendants, to be like those of Perez. For this man is really not generally regarded as an outstanding example of fruitfulness. Perez was one whom Tamar bore to Judah, and the story is told in Genesis 38, and since Tamar's situation had been not unlike Ruth's, the story may be relevant. Then we got to bear in mind, too, that Perez was apparently the most important of Judah's sons. He seems to be mentioned more prominently than Shelah, who was older. And the tribe of Judah apparently depended upon Perez's descendants more than those of others. As the book of Ruth is set in the territory of this tribe, this comparison would seem to be apt. Moreover, Perez was one of Boaz's ancestors, and thus a suitable person to be mentioned here. Indeed, it seems that Perez was the ancestor of the Bethlehemites in general. He gave his name to the section of the tribe of Judah that's descended from him. And so it is the gift of God for which they pray. It's unlikely that he was a bachelor, that is, Boaz, but he was quite possibly a widower. You come to verses 13 through 17, and there is a marriage and the birth of a baby. Verse 13 of Ruth 4, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in to her. And the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today. And may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. The court is over. Boaz proceeds to wed Ruth. Went in unto her is the usual Old Testament expression for sexual intimacy. Throughout this book, there is consistent thought that God is over all and works out his will. We have just seen that the elders and others regarded children as God's gift. And we see the same thought now from the writer. Children seen as God's gift. Isn't that the way it should be? And in a country that has since 1973 taken the life of 62 million unborn children, it causes one to feel shame. In verse 14, it is interesting to notice that it is Naomi who is featured in the closing scene, not Ruth. The women of the city are delighted by the birth of the child, and we've previously seen their interest in Naomi when she returned to Bethlehem from Moab. And they come to her now rather than to Ruth, possibly because they knew her better, and possibly because they understood her greater need for companionship. After all, Ruth has got a new husband, and she's got a new baby, and has a lot to fill her life. But the women congratulate Naomi, but consistently with what we've seen throughout the book, they ascribe what has happened to the hand of the Lord. Blessed be the Lord. But they recognize that this gift comes from Him. It is basic that God is over all men and all things to our narrator. And He brings His plans to pass. So in this book now and then, an expression of this sort allows us to see that really God is the principal participant. He is the one who's given Naomi the blessing. The reason given for the thanksgiving is that God has not left Naomi without a kinsman. The women are speaking about the new baby. God has sent the child to be Naomi's kinsman, the heir. Verse 15, the women prophesy that the child will mean much to his grandmother. He is the restorer of life for her. And it is a general term of good. He is good for her. His presence is good for her. And the women go on to reason for their hope. They put an emphasis on the word daughter-in-law. The daughter-in-law, they characterize as one who loves you. And the love of Ruth for her mother-in-law shines in this book. And it's appropriate in the final passages that it should be highlighted and receive recognition. The tribute, which is better to you than 7 sons, is all the more striking in view of the place that is typically afforded to sons in comparison with daughters in ancient Israel. A numerous male progeny, that was the ambition of married people. And thus to speak of Ruth as being worth more than 7 sons to Naomi is the supreme tribute. For 7 sons is a proverbial expression referring to the perfect family. Verse 16. As was only to be expected, Naomi took a special interest in the baby. She took him up into her arms, she placed him on her lap, and one imagines that there would have been no difficulty in obtaining a nurse for the son of Boaz. But for Naomi, this child is special. She had expected a lonely old age when her husband and her sons had died. With none of those left near, her future looked bleak. But thanks to Ruth's devotion, everything is now different. She belongs to a family once more. She is loved. She has a recognized position. The baby, in a sense, symbolized all of that. And Naomi gave herself over to the caring of and keeping of that child. And she recognized that little baby as, in some sense, hers. In verse 17, the women of the village didn't cease their interest when they pronounced the blessing. They took an interest in how the baby should be named, and indeed actually gave him a name. They pronounced that a son has been born to Naomi, and in the way families were reckoned, this was indeed the case. And the child was, in effect, the son of Mahlon, and thus, though Ruth was not her daughter, Ruth's boy was counted as Naomi's descendant. Boaz was primarily the Goel to Elimelech. He should accordingly have married Naomi to raise up a child to Elimelech, but since Ruth was too old, Naomi, was too old, Ruth stood in a sense, and the child was Naomi's as well as hers. Naomi is specifically said to be the child's nurse. The women gave him the name Obed. And to some it seems curious that women outside the family should be able to intervene in this fashion, but it may be that their kindly interest so impressed Boaz and Ruth that they accepted the suggestion and approved of the name. Obed means servant. The name is not found very frequently in the Old Testament, and we don't know anything about anyone who bore it, since it occurs only in lists of names and genealogies. But perhaps they imply that the baby will serve Naomi, in whom they do have a special interest. The verse concludes with a little note concerning Obed, connecting him with David, the child who was born as a result of the marriage which took place after such curious happenings as narrated in this book. That child was the grandfather of Israel's greatest king. He ends the book in verse 18 through 22 with a short genealogy. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron. To Hezron was born Ram. To Ram was born Amminadab. To Amminadab was born Nahshon. And to Nahshon Salmon. And to Salmon was born Boaz. And to Boaz Obed. And to Obed was born Jesse. And to Jesse David. And so he covers about 650 years there with just 10 names. Significant men in this genealogy. And why he included that there, God wanted him to, would be my explanation. And to show that the Lord is always watching over his people like Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and directs their paths, and that he never forgets, God never forgets his purpose. And the issue of the marriage of Boaz and Ruth was to lead in due course to the great King David, the man after God's own heart, the man in whom God's purpose was so signally worked out. These events in Moab and Bethlehem played their part in leading up to the birth of David. And the Christian will think also of the genealogy at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. And he'll reflect that God's hand is over all history, that God works out his purposes generation after generation. Limited as we are to one lifetime, each of us sees so little of what happens. A genealogy is a striking way to bring before us the continuity of God's purpose through the ages. The process of history is not haphazard. There's purpose in all of it. And the purpose is the purpose of God. I hope that you'll be with us next time. May God bless you this day.